Hello again, this is Tina. This is part 2. I apologize for getting cut off. But the criminal justice system, just to recap, the corrections department of the criminal justice system is, it's evolved over time. And the main thing is to help offenders learn how to become more productive members in society, with the overall goal is to reduce crime and the chances of them reoffending. Okay. The Safe Streets Act of 1968, Gun Control Act, is what is more familiar as known. The main thing that it's known for is its contribution to making restrictions on purchasing guns. You have to be 18, you have to be registered, they began to do background checks on citizens in the United States. Organized Crime Control Act of 1970. Some of the issues were related to drugs, but it was related to the transfer, the sale, the trafficking of drugs. So they've increased the RICO violations to include Organized Crime Control Act, establishing that entities or a person that establishes a pattern of racketeering activity constitutes 2 or more instances of interstate enterprise gaining or keeping interest of conspiring to invest in. So basically, if you have a business and you're doing illicit business knowing or you're helping somebody traffic drugs, that's one offense, and 3 strikes, you're out. So it's 2 or more people that are involved, and it's considered a RICO violation. So the FBI learns to leverage with more responsibility the political law enforcement relationships to help leverage the people in order to, with these laws, can get more people to help turn on offenders or suspects and give up incriminating information. With more resources, they are able to bring more justice. The Crime Control Act of 1974. This is the federal assistance grants. So the biggest increase in federal contributions, it's established funding to support the law enforcement agencies to help maintain law and order with comprehensive programs and strategies directed to control crime, prevention, as well as Hello, this is Tina Gauthier again. This is part 2, Criminal Justice System and Corrections. It's evolved a great deal over time. Its efforts we have gone from incarcerating criminals to how can we rehabilitate them with using programs of education, medical treatment for addiction, psychological and mental health counseling, and overall to help make them become better citizens. What they learned was that the longer you have somebody incarcerated, they become hardened criminals that tend to reoffend. So to reduce that, by focusing on how they can acquire new skills and manage their behavioral processes, so institutionalize the offender before they're being released back to society, to try to prevent them from continuing a life of crime. The Safe Streets Act in 1968, the biggest contribution was the Gun Control Act. In the United States, you now had to be 18 and up. You have to be a legal resident, a citizen of the United States, in order to purchase firearms. organized crime in the 1970s. Over the years, they strengthened with their ability to weave through the laws and not be held accountable for trafficking, drug trafficking, selling. And because it continued to be a problem, therefore there was a continued focus. So now in 1970, the RICO Act was introduced where it makes it clear that 2 or more people constitutes a RICO violation, establishing a pattern of racketeering activity as a legal method to leverage people into not contributing to those acts. So they tried to use it as a deterrent, and then they also used it as sentencing guidelines increased. They used it to have them turn on the bigger fish. So, and this is where the FBI really gained some leverage with political and law enforcement relationships. They were able to identify targets of mutual interest, pulling all their resources together, the technical aspects, investigative sources, and participating in the Organized Crime Task Force to accomplish their goals. The Crime Control Act of 1974 is where the federal government gets involved and gives more grants and funding to law enforcement agencies who can identify preventive measures in reducing crime, support initiatives that engage in empowering the community, communities that are at risk in order to reduce crime, as well as systematically improve and produce effective programs for the criminal justice system that will strengthen the rule of law and the reduction of crime. Through 6 programs to support this effort, they again are funded by the federal government. It's now the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the Bureau of Justice, National Institute of Justice, Office of Juvenile and Delinquent Prevention, Office for Victims of Crimes, and Office of Sex Offenders, Sentencing, Monitoring, Apprehending, Registering, and Trafficking. Smart. Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act of 2011. So this is where the Reform Act comes into play, helping juveniles before they actually get into the system. So basically, it ended detention of any jailing of any non-criminal status offenders. So what that means is any juvenile, any individual under the age of 18 is considered a juvenile. If, like a runaway, they would be normally placed in a detention center. So they're no longer doing that. So status offenses that if it's not a crime as an adult, it's not a crime as a child. So they're not incarcerating, but rather they're not holding them in detention centers. Another initiative for the JJDP Act was to promote community-based alternatives for detention. So they have programs where they, like the military programs, things like that, where they can go into a 6 to 8 week program to try to change their behavior. And then they also, there was a mandate that stated that the removal of any juvenile under sight and sound mandates. What that means is a child, if they did something that was an offender, they don't have a place to put them. They used to go into the jail system with adults, but based on this mandate, they were no longer able to because it does more harm to their mental state. So to keep them away from adult offenders, to keep them safe, where they can't be taunted by them, and because it became very dangerous for juveniles in the prison system when they had no other place to hold them. So they began to create separate quarters, separate detention centers for juveniles that were having delinquent behaviors. Okay. The Crime Control Act of 1984 And this is where the forfeit of assets became a big thing. So if you got caught with racketeering or money laundering, you forfeit your assets. So federal grants and other areas of the criminal justice would then transfer the surplus. So basically, if I became a millionaire because I'm a drug dealer, and I get caught and I get sentenced, and I'm now basically I would have to forfeit anything that I have in my name or anything of value and then would transfer to ownership to the state in which they are in. So they forfeit of assets for let's say a RICO violation, but obviously on a bigger scale. So the Crime Control Act of 1990, much of this act focused on the crime against children with the goal to improve the investigation and prosecution of child abuse cases, creating programs to support the victims with services with child advocates, volunteers, trained personnel on training of personnel on how to handle the different situations. The biggest thing is really creating a support system for victims of child abuse. And this includes child abuse, child pornography, kidnapping, with increased provisions against any domestic abusers. So the increase of mandatory sentencing and violent offenders. So what this means is that anyone who is convicted of violent crimes against children, which is considered like the pornography and the kidnapping and so on, they would get higher sentences, as well as increased additional what is the word I'm looking for? Additional laws like registering as a sex offender, things like that, if they were involved in sexual crimes. Okay, so the Violent Crime Control Act of 1994. It's extensive funding and more funding for the police department, but this one is the focus on creating more police. So this was an initiative that mandated the hiring of 100,000 new police officers with legislations for gun control with the federal assault weapons ban, expansion of the federal death penalties, the statutes for violent crimes against women, supporting policing, prosecuting, and victim services, the registering, as I stated before, of sex offenders, funding to support youth anti-gang programs, and so on. So basically, when they decided that they need more police officers, they didn't just want to hire police officers. They realized that there needs to be a reflection of the community. So they were also looking to hire people that represent representatives of the community. So more diversity. So the final report for the President's Task Force of the 21st Century was created in May of 2015, and the focus was Obama is building trust and legitimacy of the police officers. The way that they plan on doing it is with policies and oversight, investment in technology and social media, community policing initiatives with crime reduction, training and education of police officers, and ensuring the safety of and wellness of police officers. So I believe that the 21st century policing is not normalizing over-policing, but it's more of an investment in change. So let's move away from biases. Let's move away from systemic racism and applying it in the criminal justice system. I think that we also need to minimize, like there shouldn't be mandatory sentencing guidelines. I think they should be a little bit more flexible with that. But the biggest investment right now you'll see in the community is talking about defunding the police. I think that that's one of the biggest things that I can see that we can benefit today, and that would be in the investment in community policing, or the reinvestment in community policing. And what that basically means is to make sure that we represent the community, we're there for the community, Our job is not to police.